Good morning, everyone. We are in Perek Bet of Megillat Esther, Pasuk Yud Aleph. And just to remind everyone where we are at in the story, obviously we are post the either banishment or execution of Vashti. Achashverosh once again has listened to his advisors, and he's gathering all of these young maidens to be able to pick a new queen. We talked about the fact that they went first to the Beit Hanashim, to Hegai, to be prepared. It was a 12-month process of perfuming and everything else you could imagine. I would have to almost imagine that 12 months in a spa would get a little bit boring at some point, but maybe not. But they were preparing for 12 months. And then in Pasuk Yud Aleph, we have this interesting statement, Uvechol yom vayom Mordechai mitalech lifnei chatzar beit hanashim ledat et shlom Esther. That every single day, Esther's already been brought to the Beit Hanashim. If you remember the word that was used, the verb that we'll see again is vatilakach, that she was taken there. And the Chazal take this as an approach of saying she was taken against her will. And in fact, that against her will plays an important role in a question that I'm not sure we dealt with last week, but the question will be, we can understand when Esther, in the beginning of the story, everything is being done against her will, and that she was ultimately, according to against her will, was raped by Achashverosh. But ultimately, when we come to the most dramatic scene of the Megillah, or the second most dramatic scene of the Megillah, where she decides to go to Achashverosh and to plead for her family, she re-engages with Achashverosh, and afterwards she remains married to Achashverosh, remains his queen. It would seem to be that idea of force has been removed. How is it possible that this extraordinary Jewish woman would remain with this foreign king? He's the Achashverosh. No one ever suggested he converted. No one ever suggested anything's changed. So how is that possible? And there's actually a tshuva about this that's found in the Noda B'Yehuda. The Noda B'Yehuda, in the second edition of Tshuvos in Yoredei Siman Kuf Samach Aleph 161, addresses this fact, and ultimately we don't have a better answer than what he offers, and that ultimately it must have been based on a halachic decision. That's the conclusion, because we can't answer it any other way. But Esther is there. Esther is in the Beit Hanashim. At this point, still, we can feel more comfortable that more comfortable. Halachically, it would be pretty clear that it's against her will what's happening right now. And the next step of the puzzle is Mordechai is going every single day to check on her. Now, Mordechai checking on her every single day is strange, okay? Because how does he have a right to walk by the harem? And even though Hegai is the guard of the harem and won't let him in, nevertheless, to walk by, it would seem to arouse suspicion. And so the Ibn Ezra, in the first nusach of the Ibn Ezra, says that this is proof that Mordechai must have had some significant official role within the court of the king, that otherwise something else would have happened to him. And as much as you would imagine something else, he had the rights. And so they didn't say anything to him. The Dat Mikra actually adds one more piece. The Dat Mikra says you also have to recognize this tension that's going in Mordechai's head. Because on the one hand, Mordechai tells Esther, don't reveal who you are. And every single day, Mordechai is going and asking about Esther. Well, it's not hard to put two and two together. She was taken from Mordechai's house. Okay, maybe they forgot that fact. Maybe the people who brought her didn't reveal where she came from. But then she doesn't say who she is, but Mordechai, the Jew, Mordechai Yudeo, Yosef Shara Melech, right? It's Mordechai who's the Jew, is looking in after her. There's got to be something that's going on. Now, the Ibn Ezra goes even one step further. What's he doing? He's checking to see if she needs any kind of medical attention, anything that's necessary for her. Maya Seba. And what is going to be with her? Now, ultimately, again, he wanted he wanted somehow to anticipate what was going to be the end of the story. He had no control over the situation. He still wants to anticipate, and that's what he's looking. Rashi says, "Lo ira litzadeket zot shetilakach l'mishkav harel." Rashi says, it's impossible in Mordechai's mind to say that such should be the end of the Esther story. That such a woman as Esther should ultimately have to live her life in such a situation. It must be, says Mordechai, that there's some grander plan. Rashi says Atida lakum lo shiat Yisrael, that ultimately she's going to be the salvation of the Jewish people. Mordechai's just trying to put two and two together. It doesn't make sense in his mind what's happening. So he says all of these pieces, and that's what's happening. And now v'hagia Torah na'ara v'na'ara levo el hamelech Achashverosh. Okay, and when every one of the women who had been brought, when it's their turn to come before Achashverosh, okay, when it comes, these women to come before Achashverosh, chodesh, after the 12 months have passed, because those 12 months is the amount of time it takes, and we're still in a parenthetical comment, 6 months in myrrh oil, and 6 months of perfuming, nashim, and all of the other accoutrements that a woman would want to have. After all this, that's when the woman would come. Now, if you look in the words, and this is an important piece that we'll get into in terms of the trup, and I'm sure people have heard this in the past, that when you look at the trup itself, uvahagia is a very, very dramatic note, and then Torah, na'ara v'na'ara is ultimately a kadma ve'azla. A kadma ve'azla, meaning that in Aramaic, go forth and come out. In other words, kadma lekadem, to move forward, and azla, moving. Right? There is this kind of movement associated with their presentation. It's a very dramatic. The background music of the trup is really this kind of celebratory music that's associated with it. And when we're going to see it, and just a little bit later, when you look at when it's Esther's turn to go, you'll see that Esther, and just if you turn for a moment to Pasuk Tetvav, where it says, "Uvahagia Torah Esther bat Avichail dod Mordechai asher lakach lo levad lavo el hamelech lo biksha davar." It keeps on going, and then it says, if you look at all of these words at the trup under there, "Uvahagia Torah Esther bat Avichail dod," right? It's munach. The little, it's like a right angle under the letters. It's called the munach, which means there's this hesitation. It's like each word, uvahagia, Torah Esther, bat Avichail, dod. Each step it's very, very slowly. So the Gram, the Vilna Gaon says that the trup indicates to us what kind of emotions were here. That when it came to these other women in the kingdom who had been brought before Achashverosh, it was a moment of celebration. They would have a possibility of their moment in the sun that may last a lifetime. But when it was the turn for Esther to go, it was with this great hesitation. The trup adds a tremendous amount here. And ultimately, when you have those six months, you have those 6 months, and the 6 month, the 12 months of preparation. Just imagine a poor girl in the empire, or the Persian Empire, what these opportunities were, even if, God forbid, they weren't chosen as the queen, they still were assured a lifetime of some level of prominence and definite care and food, and all of these other things are available to them. So they're celebrating all of these pieces. With all of this preparation, this is how she came forward. Now, what's uvazeh? Uvazeh, Rashi says, well, with all of this prep, with the perfumes and the jewelry and all of the other things she got. The Reb Sajagon says a little bit differently. Reb Sajagon says that uvazeh is talking about according to the law, that this was the rules. This is the method by which she came. Et kol asher tomar yinatein la lavo imami beit hanashim ad beit hamelech, and anything she had requested to prepare herself for this appearance before the king, she was given. The reason why this is so significant to us is because, again, we're going to have the contrast with Esther, who doesn't request a thing. So you could get anything you want in the world, and Esther says, I don't want anything. Haggai is going to take care of her and give her whatever she wants, whatever he wants her to have. At night, she would go to the king, and he would have his way with her. And then in the morning, she would go back to the Beit HaNashim Sheni. Now, what is Sheni? So Reb Sajagon says, Sheni is attached to the phrase Beit HaNashim. There was a primary harem, and there was a secondary harem. The primary harem had Haggai was watching over it. The secondary harem has Eliad Shashgaz Saris HaMelech Shomer HaPilagshim, is the secondary harem of the handmaidens, the Pilagshot, and that's where she would go. She would go from the Beit HaNashim to the Beit HaPilagshim, or to the Beit HaNashim Hasheni. Now, the other pieces, and this is according to the Chochmei Tzfat, Chochmei Tzfat says El Beit HaNashim Sheni, and this doesn't follow the trop, but Beit HaNashim Sheni means that she was secondary. She became a second class, that she had walked out as a potential queen, and she leaves now as a Pilegesh. Okay, and both of those, we're not sure if it's attached. If you look at the trop, you'll see that in the trop you have a Kadman as a Kev Katan. So according to the trop, Reb Sajagon's explanation works perfectly, because a Kadma with a Kev Katan are two connected words. The trop connects them. So it's Beit HaNashim Sheni, the secondary house, as opposed to returning to the house, to the harem, and a secondary status.
Well, wasn't the first house the house of maidens?
No, because we'll see actually the Beit HaNashim, the maidens were taken there, but that's where the queen would also live. We'll see.
When I say maidens, I was trying to think.
Virgins. Yeah, no, but ultimately the queen was going to live in that also. That's where Esther would live. In the first house. The first house was the primary house. That primary house, all of the candidates were brought. Okay. Ultimately, Esther is going to be brought back there. Okay, so that is the primary harem.
So they went back there if they were.
If they would be chosen as queen, they were going to go back to Haggai. Then they're going to Shashgaz, to the yeah. But you know what? You're right. Okay, but we can't try to superimpose our values and our morals on what went on 2,500 years ago.
Isn't so different.
Well, if he made his decision, they would put it to the second.
If he made a decision, or right, okay. But if you notice in Pasuk Yudalit, it adds an extra piece. Lo tavo od el hamelech ki im chafetz b'hamelech v'nikra b'shem. There was this slight hope that these women had, and that is that they could be called back to the king. Okay, if they would be called back, then he would summon them by name. The Ibn Ezra says actually that this is an opportunity that if the king wouldn't find somebody who met his expectations, and we had talked about the expectations was not just beauty, but expectation was also a sense of independence. Okay, something which he had valued in Vashti until he was drunk and his advisors told him, and she embarrassed him. But this sense of strength that if he wouldn't find somebody, that according to the Ibn Ezra, they could be called back into duty. It wasn't a permanent decision. There was still a temporariness of this. Okay, and only in that kind of case. Now, Nikra Avashem, the second version of the Ibn Ezra's commentary, and I keep on mentioning these unusual Rishonim. The Ibn Ezra is not unusual. Moshe Chalav is an unusual one. There was an edition published probably about 15, 20 years ago of the Torat Chaim, Mikrot Gedolot, and the Chamesh Megillot. Actually, I remember when they were being put out because the editor of those were Mordechai Katzenellenbogen. Mordechai Katzenellenbogen's wife, he's passed away, but his wife is Ilana Hirschler Katzenellenbogen, Rav Hirschler's daughter. So I remember when they were coming out because this was a point of great pride for them, for the family, for the Hirschler family as well. Many of us remember Rav Hirschler when he was Rosh Yeshiva in the Yeshiva. And in fact, in the introduction, he thanks Rav Hirschler as well to all of these pieces. So he actually had in his Mikrot Gedolot, he actually included a number of manuscripts of Rishonim that we didn't have in our previous Mikrot Gedolot. So if you look in the Mikrot Gedolot today, you won't have them. But if you look in the Torah Chaim, you'll find them. So we have these two versions of the Ibn Ezra that he brings very clearly, and other Rishonim, the Chachmei Tzarfat you have there, and other Rishonim that he found in locations of manuscripts and included them in these commentaries. So the Ibn Ezra, the second edition of the Ibn Ezra, says V'nikra'ah v'shem is not that he called her by name, but that she was a known person, that there was some knowledge of her, and the king would go ahead and take the one whose name was known. Is the other way of explaining the pasuk. Yeah, Barry.
At this juncture, does Mordechai have any inkling of what is about to occur?
According to the Rashi that I mentioned, Mordechai is convinced something is going to happen because it just doesn't fit in his zeitgeist that all of a sudden this wonderful woman would be taken to the king, but he doesn't have an idea yet that Haman is going to come on the scene. He doesn't have an idea of how things are going to play out, but he has that kind of faith which says that there's got to be some reason behind all of this. And that, according to Rashi, is why he keeps on checking.
Well, but it really isn't surprising that she was taken because he took let's say the 100, 200, whatever the number was, most beautiful women, of which she was obviously one.
Yeah.
Not so unusual.
Yeah, but if you remember, it wasn't just most beautiful. When we describe Esther, it was beauty, but it wasn't just that. Yeah.
Well, in line with that question, it appears to us that she was the only Jewish girl taken, lady taken, however you want to refer to Esther. It appears that she's the only Jewish one. Or is it just that this is the one that belongs to Mordechai?
We don't know if she's the only Jewish one.
Right.
And it would seem to be that if he was taking all the Narot Tulot, that there may have been other Jewish girls there. Now remember, even no matter what period of time we're talking about, we are talking about either between the first and second Beit HaMikdash or once the second Beit HaMikdash has been built, and depends again on that great question of the chronology. But no matter which way we go, we're in a country where there's a tremendous amount of assimilation. When the Jews were in the Galut, the assimilation was very, very high to the extent, and we know this clearly from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, that the vast majority of the Jews chose to stay in Galut. They didn't choose to make Aliyah back with Zerubbabel and with Ezra and Nehemiah when the decree came. You know, it's one thing to be critical of us, and there's room to be critical of us that we have the opportunity to make Aliyah, we don't make Aliyah, okay? But we live in a generation that has gotten used to this idea of Golus for about 2,000 years. They were in a generation where if they didn't remember the Beit HaMikdash, their grandparents remembered the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, this was, to them, being in Galut was a relatively new experience. And they were very much into this Persian culture. We also see it, by the way, from the involvement of the Jews, according to the Medrash, in the celebrations that took place in Perek Aleph, that the Jews participated in some fashion in the celebrations of Achashverosh. Some Midrashim say that they participated in the extreme negative, and others say that they were struggling in how to not insult the king and still be part of it. Yeah.
I found it very interesting that it says here, "Ubechol yom v'yom," going back to the pasuk of Aleph, "Ubechol yom v'yom Mordechai mitzalech b'fnei chatzar beit Hashem." In the comparison sheet that you gave us,
Yeah.
it's not listed, the V'chol yom v'yom, because I understand where it's compared to Yosef, the Indian of Yosef in Gracious, where it says,
Right.
"Lo shama alei elecha," Yosef doesn't listen to the Eshet Potiphar.
Right.
But it's still, V'chol yom v'yom is almost unnecessary, since V'chol yom would have been sufficient. So V'chol yom v'yom adds to that sense of there's something about Hashgacha here, about the Jews in a land that's not theirs, somehow being associated with some upper echelon, and not knowing what's going to happen, but that sense of Hashgacha is something is a
Well, so whenever you take, we know this, whenever there's this doubling of words, it can mean, when you say B'chol yom vayom, okay, it's each and every day, right? Where we would say it. There's an emphasis that this was a constant. Sometimes you double a verb in Hebrew because you want to strengthen the verb. Here we're doubling this noun, okay, because we're saying it's a constant. This was something, and this I think goes back again to Rashi. Rashi says this is something he's doing because it has to be. He keeps on checking. He keeps on checking because he has such great belief that there's got to be some bigger piece to this. Now, again, there is also a great concern he has for her. And you could also say that he's checking every day because he's scared. He doesn't know, but he's risking a lot by checking. He's risking her life theoretically. If we say that had she been known as a Jew, her life would have been at stake, we don't know. And he's risking perhaps his life in terms of his loyalty, assuming that he is an official in the palace of some nature. He's risking her life as well.
So when it says
His life, I mean.
Seba, means what is Hashem doing with her? Because
What-
that's in the passive sense. It doesn't say.
What will
is
be
the
done
king
with her?
doing with her?
Right, both.
Or it's so really.
Yeah, it can be either way. Listen, we also know that the Medrash has a good time, that later on, when we talk about Hamelech, okay, that and it's when the king can't sleep at night, right? That the Medrash talks about Hamelech is not Achashverosh, that the Melech is God. So we see, again, throughout this, we see that God is in the background. Now, again, as I had mentioned, God being in the background on this could have been, well, it was, first of all, in the time of Chazal, was a point of great contention whether or not we should consider this a sacred book. Because if you don't mention God in a holy book, well, is it holy? On the other hand, we also talked about the fact that it may have been a conscious decision because of the nature of these events, that these events were national Persian events that took place. Achashverosh was a personality, and these events would be shared. I mentioned this last week. These events were going to be shared with 127 provinces. This book is something that's being shared, and if you recall, one of the positions in Chazal is that God isn't mentioned because we were afraid that if we said God, that they would replace it with the name of an idol. Or another piece of it is that you want to go ahead and you want to be able to maintain your relationship, your Jewish relationship with these people. You don't want to keep on saying that God outwitted the king, that this is the king operating. And so the book is a real interesting study. Also, if you look at it from a literary perspective, and not to diminish its sanctity, but if you look at it from a literary perspective, the fact that God's name is missing can be viewed as God operates in the background when we're in Galut. It could be viewed as we were trying to be safe and not allow the non-Jews who had access to this book to refer it to other gods, or we're trying to be able to be politically correct and maintain God's absence, because if we introduce God in this, we're separating ourselves from the Persian people. And this isn't the Persian actors on the stage, but a God on the stage in the background. So, right, we don't know. And when it says, as a result, Ma ye'asela, what's going to happen with her? Yeah, it's passive. She is being played upon. She's not the player right now. Okay, and as a result, it could be HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it could be the king. Mordechai just wants to know what's going to happen. In the next pasuk is the one I already had mentioned. Dod Mordechai. Okay, now if you notice that Dod Mordechai already, we have this very, very dramatic note over it. Asher lo tilakach lo levat. Okay, lavo el hamelech. When all of these things occurred. Now, if you look, there's two things. So again, the trop I mentioned, that's the Vilna Gaon talks about it. Okay, munach, that once many years ago when I was first learning this in class, we talked about the fact that munach means you can imagine her taking a step. It's like her walking slowly down the corridors into the king's chambers. It wasn't something that she was rushing into. But if you also look at it, there's something else strange. Why doesn't it just say Uvegia tor Esther lavo al melech? Why do we have all of her yichus? What's the whole piece there? And so Yoshua Bachrach, who used to teach at the Michlala, he suggested that this is also part of the drama. that even from a language perspective, not just musical, but even the words were dragging out this process by giving more and more of her yichus. That as she's going, and while she's walking, says Bachrach, she's walking there, and she herself is thinking, who am I walking here? I'm the daughter of Avichail. I'm the cousin of Mordechai. Look, who am I? I'm not just a person. I'm not just an object. That she's imagining this herself. She comes, says, Asher Elamelech lo viksha davar. She doesn't ask for anything. Now that is in direct context, okay? To a contrast to what had happened when in Pasuk Yud Gimel, et kol asher tomar yinaten la lavo imami beit hanashim, that all of the others got anything they wanted. Esther didn't ask for anything. Ki'im et asher yomar Hegai saris hamelech shomer hanashim. The only thing that she took with her was just whatever Hegai told her to take. In other words, she just did not want to initiate anything. In that same sense, if you look at the Ibn Ezra again says that lo biksha davar, the only thing she did have was seichel and anava. Seichel and modesty she brought with her. She brought her unique personality as well. But again, if she didn't say, and you'll see in the very next pasuk, in just a moment, we'll get to the word tilakach, this is all against her will. Vatihi Esther noset chen beinei kol ro'eh. Esther just had this chen. It doesn't say she's the most beautiful. She's the most graceful in everyone's eyes. So all of this is happening to Esther at the same, it's happening to her. And the pasuk then emphasizes it in pasuk Tet Zayin, "Vatilakach Esther el hamelech Achashverosh el beit malchuto." Esther was taken. This is against her will. B'chodesh asiri u'chodesh Tevet, in the 10th month, which is the month called Tevet. Bishnat Shevel Malchuto. It's the 7th year. Right now, right time in the year. Now, Tevet, by the way, remember, Tevet is not a Jewish name. Our months that we have, that we use nowadays, came back with us from Bavel. We use a lot of things from Bavel. Okay, our Hebrew alphabet, we brought back from Bavel. Okay, we call it the Assyrian alphabet. And until, and I've mentioned this in other Sherim, until modern times, Assyrians who were Christians, in fact, a lot of the what we'll refer to as Arabs who live in the Devon area, east of California, and would, if a generation or two ago, if you'd have referred to them as Arabs, they would have been terribly insulted because they're Assyrian Christians, many of them, and most of them are Assyrian Christians. Assyrians, their alphabet was the alphabet that we're reading right now in the Megillah. Okay, we took their alphabet. It's not the old Hebrew alphabet. This is actually the Assyrian alphabet. And I think I mentioned once, many years ago, I was at a meeting. There was a meeting of some imams and some priests and some rabbis, and I got schlepped into that meeting because I wanted to be a nice person. And the one thing that I got out of that meeting was one of the Assyrian leaders asked me if I'm fluent with Hebrew. And the reason he wanted to know is they had some Assyrian books that were over 100 years old that were written with Hebrew letters. And they weren't fluent in reading the Hebrew letters because in modern times, the Arabs, when they took over the countries, forced them to change their alphabet to Arabic. And so their books were written in Assyrian. When I was in the yeshiva, one of the janitors in the yeshiva was Assyrian, and he spoke Aramaic. We didn't realize, when we found out he spoke Aramaic, we were having a blast because he spoke Gemara to us. Okay, and this is, so Tevet is one of those names. It's not a Hebrew name. It's not a Hebrew name. It's a month that we use. When we go back to it, there are 3 names: Ziv and Bul and Etanim are names that we find in Vim Rishonim. There were names that were original names of the month. The absolute original names were just numbers. Okay. So HaChodesh is Elechem Rosh Chodeshim Rishon Hu Lachem Chodshei Hashanah, Perek Yud Bet and Sefer Shemot, Pasuk Bet. It says this is the first month of the year. It's the first month of the months of the year. So we had Chodesh HaRishon, Chodesh HaSheni, Chodesh HaShlishi, It's like when you go in certain places in Manhattan, it's easy to find your way because you just know the number. You don't have to figure out where Albion is. Okay. You don't need the 100 North or the 100 East or West. So the same thing, you knew which month it was by the number of the month. And so this is actually part of the transitional piece. It's Chodesh Asiri, which is Chodesh Tevet, which is called Tevet. Yeah.
Is it possible that she would use beauty treatments because she's going against her will and she did not want to enhance her beauty?
100%, 100%. She didn't want to do anything. She didn't want to be a player in this. She was being taken. And if she's being taken, she can't fight because if she fights, she's fighting against the king. Okay. She, at some point they have the right of life and death over her. On the other hand, she can, I guess we would use a phrase, passive aggressive at this point, and how she's reacting to this, and appropriately so. We understand that. Now, if you continue, Esther's mazel was, but ultimately our mazel is that Esther was beloved from all of the other wives, and she was graceful before him from all of the other virgins. And he went ahead and he chose her in place of Vashti. Fascinating on this piece, if you think about it, he goes ahead and he does this. One, it doesn't say because she's the most beautiful. It's that element of chen that comes through. So we don't know. Yes, Sam.
There's another word that's added here.
Chesed.
Exactly. As compared to the pasuk before.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So it's this is a henditis where you have two words that come together as a piece. Normally, it would mean a chen of chesed. Okay. So we really don't know all that he saw, but we do know he saw more than everything else. He had in other words, and with lahavdil elef havdalot, you watch Miss America, and they get these women up after the bathing suits and the gowns and everything else, and they interview them on how they're going to change the world, right? Okay, now they do that because I guess at some point they just felt if they don't do that, it's going to be, purely sexist. But it is one of the dumbest things you ever see, right? When you have those interviews. Now, the reality of it is, here, Esther, she may not have won the evening gown competition, but that interview, she just knocked it out of the park. And as a result, there was the chen and chesed. There wasn't the yofya, her beauty and things of that nature.
Doesn't seem like the kind of a man who's concerned with her character.
Well, it's interesting. So he was. There's two ways. Listen, the Gemara always argues on this, and this is this is Daf Yomi, but the Gemara is arguing consistently. Is he a foolish king? Was he very wise or was he very, very foolish? We have picked on him pretty well because when you look just in Megillat Esther, you see very few things that he makes his own decisions about. He's always looking to others. So we seem to be, putting our finger on the scales of the size of being foolish, the king. On the other hand, he had Vashti, and he's missing Vashti. And he had, you have to assume that Vashti wasn't his only wife. Vashti was the queen. He had two pretty active harems before all this was going on. But he didn't have anyone else there who could take the place of Vashti. And so there was something about Vashti. One position in the Medrash is Vashti lent him credibility. Remember, she was the daughter of royalty. She lent him credibility. Again, that's a Medrash that she lent him credibility. There's no reason to ignore that. But at this point in his reign, 7 years into his reign, he's king already. Credibility, we don't really need that much anymore. When he was first taking over, but he's looking for something. And what he's looking for is more than just, as Sam mentioned, more than just the beauty piece. Yeah. No, I don't think we have any indication of how old he was at the time. The historians have it. I'd have to look up because they do have some pieces in the history of how old he was. I can look that up. I don't remember, but from the Megillah, from Chazal, we don't. Not an old man. not an old man. The monarchs didn't live that long. Okay, in the ancient world, they didn't get there that long. And if you look at total number of his reign wasn't that long either.
Maybe what they're talking about, her yichus, is because she's also from royalty, just like Vashti was from royalty.
Well, but she's hiding it from him. So he doesn't know that she is Jewish. And we know he doesn't know she's Jewish, even though all of these reasons that he should have known, because at the end of the day, when she exposes Haman, it's a surprise to him.
No, what I'm saying is, in the text, they always talk about her yichus.
Right,
So she was a descendant of royalty,
right.
just like Vashti was.
Yeah, but Vashti, he used her yichus, Achashverosh uses his yichus for his legitimacy, to establish his own legitimacy as a king. Okay. Esther, he was unaware of her yichus at this point. So that if you don't know it, you can't use it for legitimacy. Yeah,
There's a weirdness here. She's taken against her will. Usually that somehow gets elicited in an interview. Imagine Miss America contest. She's up there against her will. You think she's gonna really project well?
well, if a gun is held to the Miss America, to her head,
Say it. So where would be the Chayin Chesed?
so apparently she knows there's a gun to her head, because if she blows off this process, she's in trouble. So she's got this catch-22, okay? And as much as Mordechai recognizes there must be more to the story, maybe Esther does as well. We don't know that, but she does. And sometimes when people don't want something, you can even see Chayin v'Chesed in the way they don't want it. So I wouldn't necessarily say no. The one other thing, and this just for those who like literary pieces, Pasuk, what's interesting is this perek is chiastic. Now, chiastic, if you remember the letter chi, okay, is an X, okay, which means it goes back and forth in an essence. So if you take Pasuk Yud Zayin, Ve'ahav HaMelech et Esther, okay, if you look back to Pasuk Daled, V'anara asher teitav b'nei HaMelech timloch tachat Vashti, it's like the initial piece of the perek. We started about the one who's going to find favor in the king's eyes. And now we see who found favor in the eyes. If you look at the pasuk before in Tet Zayin, Vatilakach Esther Beit HaMalchut, and then we look at pasuk Chet, Vatilakach Esther El Beit HaMelech. If you go to the next pasuk, back Tet Vav, Vati Esther Noseit Chen B'nei Chol Ro'eha, and you go back to pasuk Tet, Vatitav Hanara Beinav, Vatisachen V'Chesed Lefanav, talking about Haggai. So you see that. If you go back one, Lo Biksha Davar, the Esther didn't ask for anything. Back to Pasuk Yud, Lo Hegida Esther Tamavet Moladata. She's holding back from saying anything. Tetvav Uvagia Torah Esther and Uvagia Torah Nara V'Nara. And then you end up with the middle Pasuk, the Erev Hiba'al V'Boker Hishava is in the middle. Normally the process was night coming in and day coming out. So there's this structure that you see within the perek of how things move forward. Steps. All of it is with Esther's passivity that takes place. Moving on, Pasuk Yud Chet. We should make it. Pasuk Yud Chet. Vayas HaMelech Mishteh Gadol. Now, by the way, if we want to talk about chiastic structure again, we could go even back to Perek Aleph on this. Again, the role of banquets that he was making, these celebrations he was making, the role in the beginning was a celebration of victories, of establishing, according to Chazal, of saying that he was victorious over God, actually, because he felt the 70 years had passed and nothing had happened. Historians also point out that these points, there were victories, military victories that he was also celebrating. So Vayas HaMelech Mishteh Gadol L'chol Sarav Avadav et Mishteh Esther, the Mishteh of Esther. Now, why is he called Mishteh Esther, the banquet of Esther? Because everyone knows he just because of the choice of Esther, he's celebrating it. And he did something that people really like, that still happens nowadays. He cut taxes in her honor. He said, you don't have to give the same kind of taxes. Okay, now the taxes in those days were both labor and financial. Labor people had to be drafted into the army, so he cut back on those requirements of whether it's the labor tax or the monetary tax, and he actually sent gifts to everybody in honor of this great event. Uvikavetz betulot shenit uv Mordechai. Now, interesting, when we go ahead and he brings back the betulot shenit. Now, uvikabetz betulot shenit is a weird phrase. When he gathered these virgins a second time, okay, what exactly happening here? Does it mean a second time after the selection of Esther? Did he gather the betulot again? The Chachmei Tzarfat says, yeah, he selected Esther, and then he basically lined up all of the women he had rejected just to do a double check, just to make sure she's the best one. Okay, Rashi takes a similar answer. Rashi gives a similar response to it, not exactly the same. Ibn Ezra says, no, this is just a recap. This is just going on. And Ibn Ezra says what happens is we're going and say that when all of this happened, why? Because the first time he had gathered the Betulot actually was when Vashti was taken. So his second selection of queen, okay, with the way would be a way you could translate it. Mordechai in this is sitting in the Shar HaMelech. Now, Shar HaMelech is a significant place. The gate of the cities were always the place where the elders sat. Shoftim v'shotrim titen b'chol sharecha. You place the shoftim and shoftim in your gates. Those gates weren't just, like we think about the medieval gates where you just bring down the drawbridge and that's it. The gates were significant areas. Think about what Shar Yafo used to look like. Shar Yafo doesn't really exist nowadays because we broke the wall down to put a street through it. But Shar Yafo, gates were both, there were two things that were unique about gates in the ancient world. Very often, they had a right angle, those strange turns, because if you're riding a chariot and trying to conquer a city and you break through the outer gate, you got to slow down the horses, make the turn, and then they can get you. Okay, but the other thing is the gates were structures, and we found the gate of Achashverosh. The gates are structures with side rooms, and those side rooms were where the judges sat and the officials sat. So Mordechai is sitting in the Shar HaMelech. And Esther is not saying anything. Okay, even after she's been chosen, she's still paying attention to Mordechai. Now, if you think about it, there's an irony in this. Why was Vashti punished? Because she didn't listen to Achashverosh. What was the command that went out from the king at that point? That women have to listen to their husbands. What's happening? Achashverosh gets himself a new wife. And what's the first thing we find out about the new wife? She's keeping a secret from her husband. She's not listening to her husband. That's Professor Yonatan Grossman points this out. It's a fantastic irony that occurs. Huh?
The difference between keeping a secret and not listening. Did he ask her outright who was your family?
He didn't ask her. He didn't ask
So
her.
she didn't tell him? She's not holding a secret.
Yeah.
She's not sharing.
And where is the FBI and the Mossad, I mean, how difficult is it to find out?
Well, so again, with all of the things in the background, it's hard for us to imagine he didn't know, but we do see he doesn't know. Now, if you were to ask, is it possible for him not to know Mordechai's hanging around and all this is happening and they know she came from Mordechai? How would he not know she's Jewish? You're right. On the other hand, remember, rulers can be sequestered and rulers can be protected, and you can put these groups of people around that rulers don't know what's going on in the real world. Think of Marie Antoinette. Okay, let them eat cake. What kind of, or think of the Romanovs. Okay, we see there are emperors and kings whose assistants support them to such an extent they have no clue of what's going on around them.
Well, maybe this also lends to the idea that there's a pretense here that she's acting like one of them.
Could be. It
So
could
that
be.
it's not so much that he doesn't know, but like who you identifying with, because the Persian Empire is blending so many different peoples. And so therefore you have the opportunity to overtly or overtly assimilate, but she's not saying.
It could be, it could be, and what Meir said could be also that, she's not disobeying him, but she's not being subservient to him.
But he didn't
Okay.
know that.
He didn't know that.
He didn't know it, so when you say.
Well, that's Meir's point.
They
Meir's point.
need it, that a woman has to listen to her husband, fine and dandy. But as far as he's concerned, she's listening because.
Right. But as far as she's concerned, she's betraying his trust to a certain extent. Okay, yeah.
Are either of the men, Haggai or?
Shashgaz?
Jewish or?
No,
But they're eunuchs, though. I assume
Yeah.
they're eunuchs.
they're probably classic eunuchs because they're in charge of a harem. Later, at different points in history, the terminology of a saris just became an official. Okay, lent its name to something else, but they weren't necessarily eunuchs. But in charge of the harem would seem to be that would be the case. Kasher hayta b'amanaito, and kasher hayta b'amanaito means that there was this understanding there was a faithfulness between Esther and Mordechai, above and beyond the trust between Achashverosh and Esther. Bayamimahem. Now we enter into 3 psukim that we're going to close the parak with, a famous story. And these 3 psukim, if you think about it for a minute, encapsulate the whole story of Megillat Esther. Because what happens? Mordechai hears something that's going to be bad, something bad. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king. The king hangs those who are plotting. Okay, and then things are written down in the Chronicles. If instead of talking about Bigtan V'Teresh, if you superimposed Haman's name into this, it's actually it's the Cliff Note edition of the story of Purim. It's an interesting piece just to be aware of. And what's happening here is we aren't sure why all of this is going on the way it's going on. The Medrash Lekach Tov goes out and says that Esther actually had proposed at this point that Mordechai be given a promotion. And the reason to suggest the promotion, according to the Medrash Lekach Tov, was simply because, look, Achashverosh, my dear, your advisors that you had in place, they're the ones who got you into this mess. So can I make a suggestion? Let's not get into this mess again. Why don't you appoint somebody who's kind of proven himself as being a wise person? Appoint Mordechai. Bring Mordechai into the picture. And that's the Medrash's piece. And that says how it works from the Shar HaMelech and then the story of the Bigtan and Teresh. Possible coup. Yeah.
But how do you justify Pasuk Tess's placement where that is? Shouldn't it be before, after Pasuk Kaf?
Well, so it depends. If he compares to Lod Sheni to Mordechai Yoshev B'Shar HaMelech is a recap, right? So there are 2 things. Yeah, going way back from the beginning of the story of this episode of the story. But yeah.
How all of a sudden does Mordechai have access to Esther to tell her this?
Oh, Mordechai has access. So you mean how? We'll see how that information is going to be conveyed. It's apparently we never see communication direct between Mordechai and Esther. There's always some intermediary. Whether that intermediary is mentioned or not, again, something I mentioned last week.
Based on the English, at least.
Yeah.
No.
Well, you're jumping ahead. Yeah.
Mordechai told it to Queen Esther.
No, which had been told to her. Okay. What Mordechai had told her she's doing. In other words, this goes back to the original instruction when Mordechai said, don't reveal your background.
Oh, that's a different issue.
Yeah, but that's
inaction.
Right.
Here, there's inaction. He said to Esther.
Well,
He told her that, he
You
told her
have
that there
no
was
access to
a,
each other. but
go
they're-
ahead. Something going on.
That you're ahead of us.
you're jumping ahead. You're a few psukim ahead of us. Okay, let's get to it. Bayamim Ahem in those days, Mordechai Yoshev B'Shar HaMelech. Mordechai is in the Shar HaMelech. Okay, now obviously Mordechai in the Shar HaMelech must be important to this whole picture, right? Katzaf Bigtan V'Teresh Shnei Sarisei HaMelech Mishomrei Hasaf. 2 of Achashverosh's officials. Now here the Sarisei may just be officials, may not be eunuchs, but 2 of them by the name of Bigtan and Teresh, they plotted. Now, why were they plotting? So again, if I say that Mordechai has received a promotion. Well, interestingly, what promotion did he receive? According to the Panim Achirim, which is another medrash, the promotion they received was he got Bigtan and Teresh's job. Bigtan and Teresh were demoted to make room for Mordechai. They go ahead and they see what's going on and they want to be able to get even with him. And so what do they plan on doing? Well, they figure like this. If the best way to get rid of Mordechai and to get rid of their problem is to go ahead, they kill the king secretly, and that was their plot, and they blame it on Mordechai. And then everything will be perfect. This is not why, because Mordechai replaced him. They're not happy with Mordechai.
He
Okay.
wasn't the right kind of guard.
It wasn't the right kind. And notice what's their job? They are the Shomrei Hasaf. Shomrei Hasaf, Asaf is the threshold. They are the keepers of the doorway to the king. Okay, which is literally a gatekeeper. Okay, they're gatekeepers to access. If they have gatekeepers to access, they have the ability to allow whoever's going to go in to carry out this devious plan. Now, the lishloach yad, okay, which is lishloach yad b'melech Achashverosh, v'yivkshu lishloach yad b'melech Achashverosh, they were planning to do something against Achashverosh. Says Rashi, they were going to poison him. Okay, the Targum Sheni says, which is interestingly, and the Targum Sheni actually, the authoritative version of the Targum Sheni, which is one of the Targumim on Esther, was actually done by Professor Bernard Grosfeld, who used to daven here at Kins. He was a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee for many, many years. When he retired, he moved to Chicago. Sons come here pretty often to shul as well. Professor Grosfeld was a fascinating person. He was one of the world experts on Targum. He was a Musmach of Moshe Feinstein. He learned an MTJ, and he had his PhD from Johns Hopkins. And he did some of the very unassuming person, Balkore. He did some of the scientific editions of Onkelos were his. Published a lot of books. One of them was the Targum Sheni on Esther, which I actually helped him on a little bit on just the technical side of some of it. So I have a copy of it. And the Targum Sheni here says that what he was going to do, the plan was even more than just poisoning him. They put a poisonous snake in a cup that was going to be delivered with his food. And when he would open up the cup, the snake would bite him and he would die that way. It's even a little bit less of being able to trace it back than poison. Poison, someone did it. Poison a snake in a cup. We even know from the time of Chazal talk about this in the Shulchan Aruch. We talk about that when you have liquids that are left out overnight, we have to be careful that there may have been poisonous snakes around who may have taken a drink and left some of their poison in it. So, we know this was a real concern in those days. Vayivada davar leMordechai. Pasuk Chafbet, Mordechai became aware of all of this. Vayaged leEsther Malka. And he told Esther. Now, how did he become aware of all of this? Okay, so the Gemara Megillah says in Daf Zayin, he had Ruach HaKodesh. Rabbi Meir says he has Ruach HaKodesh. Okay. However, we also see that Rashi quotes it here also, the Gemara, that another possibility is they were speaking Tarsian to each other. They were Tarsian was their nationality. They had their own language. They didn't know. The Mordechai knew multiple languages. Why did he know multiple languages? Well, there's a famous tradition that he had been on the Sanhedrin. To be on the Sanhedrin, you don't need to know multiple languages. He had to know 70 languages. The reason why a judge on the Sanhedrin had to know multiple languages because he couldn't rely on translators to translate a case. If a judge is sitting before someone, he has to be able to understand it directly because whenever you translate things get lost in translation. And so members of the Sanhedrin had to know multiple languages. And in fact, there is another statement where we said Mordechai Balshan. We said that he had many languages, which is one of the explanations. However, there are other explanations. In Ezra, we talk about Mordechai Balshan. Is it one person, two people? Was he multiple languages? Not. Mordechai found out about all of these things. Interesting, even more than that, if you look at all the verbs here, they're all passive verbs. Vayivada, vayaged, vayivukash, right? All of these. Vayaged, I'm sorry, vayivada, not vayaged, you're right. Vayivada, that it was made known. It could be that all of this is because Somehow Mordechai found out about it. We don't know how he found out about it. And the reality is the details aren't really important to us. The outcome is what's most important to us in this case. And yeah,
So.
because it also included him being blamed for it.
Oh.
Yeah, so he would come out because he's now in this new role. Huh?
Because he took his wife or
Or s-
his niece or whatever.
Vayivuk,
and
yeah,
He's in Saras with God as well.
Vayivukash. If you notice one more time, yeah. Okay, and so it was told to Esther, and going back to your issue, just to finish off, because we have a couple more minutes, it was Vatomer Esther, I'm sorry, Vayaged le Esther, Vayivadad Vala Mordechai, Vayaged le Esther Hamalukana was told to Esther, we don't know exactly how. Vatomer Esther la Melech B'Shem Mordechai, Esther gave Mordechai the credit. This is the source, by the way, of the famous statement, if someone quotes somebody, they bring redemption to the world. Okay, Esther went ahead, she quoted Mordechai. Mordechai's actions are recorded. Ultimately, the Jews are saved. That's the source of the statement. That's the Gemara Megillah Tetvav. I have to quote Mike Myers, has a beautiful piece on that. Mike says that if you quote other people, you bring redemption to the world, because when you quote other people, that's an element of humility that you have, that you don't need to take the credit. You realize other people are important. Once we resolve this issue, interpersonal relationships between people, we give people credit where credit is due, then we bring Geulah, because what destroyed the Beit HaMikdash was the sinat chinam, was the hatred between people. This shows a love for people. And I never forget that idea of Mike.
Here she's trying to keep it quiet because she's Jewish.
Right.
So wouldn't it have been smarter from that point of view, maybe it would be such humility to say, these guys are going to try to kill you and forget Mordecai, because that's just one more link.
One more link, but remember, Mordechai now is an official in the court, right? So it has been, Mordechai conveyed to me, couldn't get to you. I heard from Mordechai.
It has nothing to do with Esther, official.
Whatever kind of official he is, right? But he is an official, so he's a known commodity. So Mordechai said that he's throwing this. Listen, there is the fact that Achashverosh did not put two and two together was not just that he was bad at math. Okay, it's part from the only way I can explain it. It's part of the miracle itself of Purim, that all of these things could happen. One last piece. They were both hung on a tree, and it came about now. Interestingly, Yoram Hazoni in his book The Dawn, which is a book on political, it's really on political theory based on Megillat Esther, he says there's three different ways that Mordechai had, if three different options Mordechai would have had to be able to make change. One is opposition. Okay, if you oppose something, sometimes by being in the opposition and yelling and screaming, you can make a difference. That wasn't available to Mordechai. He knew that wouldn't work. The other is just to accept acceptance. You can't do anything about it, and maybe at some point something will change. The third is to store up favor. Litzbor tova. Okay, if you store up the favor with others, at some point, it will be able to come back and you'll be able to use those favors. So Mordechai was, according to Hazoni and his political theories, Mordechai was using this very, very intelligent way of managing the situation. He didn't have a lot of power. He couldn't do a lot of things, but he also didn't want to let things go. And so to put these pieces together. We're going to continue next week, same place, same time. Everyone should stay healthy. And everyone should have, yes, whatever you're going to have, but we're going to have a wonderful day next week and have a good week.
Yeah.